The city was loud, restless and raw. Somewhere between the pounding bass from Piccadilly Gardens and the smoke curling out of fish and chip shops on Market Street, Manchester in the 1980s was alive. Ferociously alive. You didn't just walk through the city back then. You felt it. Neon lights reflecting off wet cobblestones. The echo of punk from Oldm Street blending with the early pulse of acid house. Students, misfits, shopkeepers, rebels, all colliding in a daily theatre of grit and culture. And if you think you know Manchester, think again. By the end of this video, you won't just see Manchester. You'll feel like you've been there. Let's walk back in time. The pavement hasn't cooled. We begin on Market Street, the heartbeat of shopping life in the 80s, packed with people, buzzing with energy. It was where you found Woolworths, street performers, bargain stalls, and shoulder-to-shoulder crowds hunting for deals. The sounds of clinking coins, buskers singing under grey skies, and double-decker buses passing by made it a city soundtrack you couldn't escape. But it wasn't just about buying things. Market Street was a stage for Manchester's everyday drama. Locals shouted greetings. Teenagers in denim jackets leaned against storefronts, blasting mixtapes from boomboxes. It was chaotic, alive, and unmistakably Mancunian, the kind of street that never really stayed still. Step onto Corporation Street, and you're stepping into the shadow of the Manchester Arndale Centre, a brutalist giant that defined the city's retail ambitions in the 80s. It was bold, concrete, and unapologetically modern. Inside, you'd find everything, from chain stores to escalators that felt like they led to the future. Outside, it was a crossroad of commuters, shoppers, and city noise. But Corporation Street had more than just commerce. It carried the pulse of a city trying to rebuild and redefine itself. Office workers rushed past punk kids. Pensioners queued at bus stops as roller skating teens darted through crowds. It was a place where the old Manchester and the new one constantly rubbed shoulders, each leaving a mark. Deansgate in the 80s felt like the spine of the city, stretching through layers of history, noise and nightlife. It was long, loud and alive, lined with pubs that smelled of spilled ale and cigarette smoke, and shop fronts that hadn't changed their signs in decades. People didn't stroll here. They moved with purpose, weaving between buses, taxis, and the occasional street preacher shouting warnings of the end times. And yet, amid the rush, there was charm. Just past the Great Northern Warehouse, you could spot old men in flat caps arguing about football outside the moon underwater, or hear the distant chime of the town hall clock cutting through the din. One oddity, the Deansgate railway station felt almost forgotten, perched above the street, like a quiet observer of chaos below. In a city evolving fast, Deansgate remained defiantly itself, scruffy, proud and impossible to ignore. Can you still feel the atmosphere of this street today, or has it completely disappeared? King Street in the 80s was where Manchester put on its best jacket and didn't care if it had a few scuffs. Once the city's banking district, it had an air of old money and quiet confidence. Granite facades, ornate doorways and marble floors inside buildings that smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. But by the 80s, finance was slipping away and high-end fashion was moving in. Vivienne Westwood once had a shop here, tucked among the tailors and boutiques that dressed everyone from lawyers to club kids with cash. Suits in the windows, synth music leaking from radios inside. It was both elegant and oddly subversive. You could walk past a luxury jeweller and then bump into someone with green hair and a leather jacket. King Street wasn't trying to be cool. It just was, in that effortless, slightly aloof Mancunian way. Oxford Road in the 1980s wasn't just a street, it was a culture clash on concrete. Home to the University of Manchester, the Royal Northern College of Music, and countless bedsits, it pulsed with youth, ideas, and a hint of rebellion. Students scribbled in notebooks by day and lined up for gigs by night, often at the academy or down toward Rafters, where Joy Division once played. The smell of fried food from greasy cafes mingled with the musty scent of old books from second-hand shops. You could catch a bus next to someone reading Marx and get off beside someone lugging a keyboard to rehearsal. One curious constant, the Holy Name Church. Solemn and steady as chaos swirled around it. Oxford Road never slept, but it always dreamed loudly, sometimes badly, but always with heart. Tib Street in the 80s was Manchester's wild little corridor, grimy, strange, and unforgettable. Long before the Northern Quarter found its hipster glow, Tib Street was famous for one thing: pets. Parrots squawked from shop windows. Hamsters spun on wheels in dimly lit cages. It wasn't just a street, it was a living, breathing pet bazaar. And locals still joked they could hear the barking from blocks away. But there was something else in the air. Between the aquariums and dog food signs, you'd spot fading murals, punk flyers stapled to lampposts, and corner shops selling everything from fuses to incense. It was cluttered, noisy, and totally authentic. Tib Street didn't care what you thought of it, and that was its magic. In a city full of stories, this was one of the weirdest chapters, and proudly so. Oldm Street in the 80s was vinyl, velvet, and venom, all in the same afternoon. Long before it became the poster child for indie cool, this street was the gritty, beating heart of Manchester's underground. You came here for record shops like Eastern Bloc or Decibel, where DJs argued over imports, and punks hunted for rare pressings like they were gold dust. But it wasn't just music, it was mood. The kind of street where you could get your boots resold, buy a fanzine, and hear 3 different accents in one shop. The graffiti on the walls wasn't decoration, it was declaration. Political, raw, and angry. Oldham Street didn't whisper, it shouted. And if you listened closely, you could hear the city's future forming in stereo. What about you? Which version of this spot do you prefer? The old one or the new one? Piccadilly Gardens in the 1980s was far from picturesque, but it was real. Before the redesigns and fountains, it was mostly concrete. Grass patches worn thin, and a bus interchange buzzing with life. Teenagers smoked under the statue of Queen Victoria. Office workers devoured chip butties on cracked benches, and pigeons ruled the square like tiny feathered gangsters. It was chaotic and weirdly democratic. A place where everyone passed through, shoppers from Market Street, punks heading to gigs, and lost tourists trying to make sense of the bus schedules. The old Piccadilly Gardens was never beautiful, but it had soul. It was the city's front porch, rough around the edges, loud at all hours, but unmistakably Manchester. Albert Square in the 80s was Manchester's stone-faced storyteller, watching decades unfold from beneath the gothic gaze of the town hall. The square didn't move fast like the rest of the city. It stood still, soaked in rain, history, and quiet defiance. By day, it hosted protests, civic speeches, and impromptu busker shows. By night, it echoed with footsteps and distant sirens. There was always a weight to the place. Kids skated past statues they didn't recognise. City workers smoked in the shadow of spires without looking up. And yet, if you paused, really paused, you'd feel the layers: industrial triumph, political struggle, and Mancunian pride, all packed into a few cobblestoned metres. In a city constantly changing, Albert Square reminded you where it all began. Castlefield in the 1980s was like a forgotten postcard, faded, water-stained, but rich with story. Long before the lofts and wine bars, it was a quiet relic of Manchester's industrial soul. Canals crisscrossed the area, reflecting rusted iron bridges and brick warehouses with boarded windows. You could walk for blocks without seeing anyone, except maybe a lone fisherman or a dog sniffing through rubble. And yet, this silence spoke volumes. Castlefield was where the Romans built their first fort, where trains first thundered into the city. By the 80s, It had become an accidental museum, steel, stone and soot frozen in time. Kids explored the ruins like an urban jungle, unaware they were climbing history. It wasn't polished or preserved, but Castlefield didn't need permission to matter. It just did. Tucked away on Quay Street, Granada Studios was more than a TV lot. It was Manchester's dream factory. If you lived in the north of England in the 1980s, chances are your television flickered with something filmed here. Coronation Street, with its cobbled set and smoky interiors, wasn't just a soap opera. It was part of your week, your living room, your identity. But behind the cameras, things were stranger. Tourists wandered the outdoor sets, hoping to spot a star. School trips gawked at control rooms with more buttons than sense. And if you were lucky, or cheeky, you might sneak a peek at Richard and Judy filming in the corner. There was glamour, but it wore comfortable shoes. Granada didn't just reflect the city, it amplified it. One episode, one accent, one stubbornly northern punchline at a time. If Manchester had a church in the 80s, it throbbed with bass and neon. It was the Hacienda. Opened in 1982 by Factory Records and funded in part by New Order, it didn't look like much from the outside. A minimalist box on Whitworth Street West. But inside? Inside was another universe entirely. This was where everything collided. Post-punk, acid house, warehouse grit and future legend. You could dance next to a stranger one night and read about them in NME the next. The club was chaotic, often broke, occasionally half empty, but it changed music history anyway. No velvet ropes, no VIP rooms, just strobes, sweat and sound that made your ribcage tremble. The Hacienda wasn't just a nightclub, it was the spark that lit the Manchester explosion. Is this how you remember it? Or is our memory playing tricks on us? The floor bounced. That's the first thing anyone tells you about the Ritz. Not metaphorically, the actual floor. A legendary sprung dance floor that moved with the crowd, turning every gig into something visceral. Open since the 1920s, but in the 80s, the Ritz found a new groove. Post-punk, goth, new wave. If it had a beat and a following, it played here. It wasn't glamorous. The walls were chipped, the bar was sticky, and the toilets were a gamble. But when the lights dimmed and the first note hit, the whole place transformed. Students swayed, skinheads stomped, couples kissed in shadows. Morrissey once called it 1980s melancholy in motion. 1980s. The Ritz didn't care who you were, just that you danced like you meant it. It looked like it had landed from another planet. And in 1980 Manchester, that was saying something. The Daily Express building on Great Ancoats Street was a glass and chrome marvel, all curves and reflections in a city still wearing soot on its bricks. Built in the 1930s, but decades ahead of its time, it felt like stepping into a sci-fi film every time you walked past. In a city of red bricks and grey skies, it shimmered defiantly. People either loved it or hated it, there was no in-between. Some called it 1980s, the Crystal Palace, 1980s, others 1980s, a giant jukebox. 1980s. But whether you worked there, wandered by, or just caught your own face warped in its mirrored skin, you remembered it. It stood for boldness, for difference, for the idea that Manchester could be modern without apology. They were supposed to be the future, bold, utopian, unstoppable. The Hume Crescents, once Europe's largest housing development, rose like a concrete maze on the edge of central Manchester. Built in the late 1960s, but by the 1980s, the dream had cracked. Literally, leaks, poor insulation and design flaws turned this modernist vision into a dystopian labyrinth. But somehow, amid the decay, life flourished. Squatters, students, artists and rebels moved in, transforming empty flats into studios, sound systems and collective chaos. Bands rehearsed in bedrooms, murals appeared overnight, and underground raves echoed through crumbling corridors. It was rough, it was wild, but it was real. The Crescents became Manchester's accidental arts district, flawed, fearless and unforgettable. Manchester in the 1980s wasn't polished, it pulsed. It was loud, unpredictable and full of corners that meant something, even if you didn't realise it at the time. From bouncing dance floors to barking pet shops, from shattered dreams in concrete towers to legendary club nights beneath flickering strobes, this city carved its identity into every street and every soul who walked them. But what about now? Are these places still the same? Or have they vanished beneath glass and steel? Let us know in the comments. Which ones surprised you? And how different or familiar do they feel today? If this trip back in time brought something alive for you, give the video a like and drop a comment. It helps more people discover Manchester's story through the eyes of those who lived it, loved it, or are just beginning to understand it.